Welcome to Uncertain Things. This is Adam once again solo because Vanessa's still dealing with her infant. Actually, my guest and I just had a conversation about what constitutes an infant. At what point does one outgrow that title? If you have suggestions, let us know.
Well, some people never outgrow it.
I was going to say, and some people regress, and some institutions regress them. But Vanessa will be joining us, God willing, very soon. But until then, I am happy to invite or welcome Coleman Hughes, author of The End of Race Politics, Arguments for a Colorblind America.
Got it.
I got it?
Yes.
Yes. First try, sort of. Coleman hosts the Conversations with Coleman podcast and writes for the Free Press.
That's right.
I always hate these introductions because I am totally incapable of performing the stilted setups, but they are important. Coleman, thank you so much for joining me.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
I should note that unlike most of our Riverside-centered conversations, Coleman and I are actually sitting across from each other.
Yeah.
Thank you for coming all the way to distant Astoria.
Of course.
So, Coleman, I think that most of our audience knows who you are. That's a guess. I did not take a poll. But just in case, how did you come into public attention?
I came to public attention when I was roughly 24 years old or maybe 23 years old. I started writing for a magazine called Quillette, which was based in Australia. And I was going to Columbia University at the time, and I was noticing the incredible level of concern about things like white supremacy, in contrast to my daily experience as a Columbia student being clearly in one of the least racist environments on earth. And so I became very curious about why is there a mismatch between what I'm reading every day in the student newspaper and what is clearly the case around me, which is that there's virtually no racism against black students here. Yet I'm reading the opposite, and it's being taken seriously. And so that gap made me curious, and I began writing for myself and then eventually trying to write for the paper.
I'm assuming you didn't arrive at Columbia thinking, I'm going to try to debunk the current perceptions about race relations in America. This is my philosophical agenda. I'm coming here seeking proof of my thesis, right? So that means that something really happened to you at Columbia that created a dissonance that was so powerful that diverted your intellectual attention to the point where, 5-6 years later, you write a book about it.
Yeah. Well, what happened is that I was dropped into an environment that was, though I grew up in a liberal town, I was dropped into an environment that, where basically far left progressive woke ideology was the reigning ideology. And when I say it was a reigning ideology, I don't mean that everyone was woke or everyone privately agreed that, gender was a social construct and that white supremacy was infused throughout American society and defund the police and all this stuff. But a solid 5 to 10% of people thought that way, and the rest of society at Columbia was sort of afraid of those people because this is back in the time when cancel culture was far more powerful than it was today, and to have an errant tweet that fell afoul of any of the progressive catechism was it felt like a death sentence for one's social life.
Did you feel that playing out on day-to-day conversations with peers at Columbia, or was it something that felt like ideas flowing down from professors?
I would say more in the second category. So in my personal day-to-day conversations with peers, like one-on-one, I had good conversations with everyone and I could disagree and things were fine. When things got crazy was in group settings. People are kind of performing for a group in classrooms. Certain professors from whether it be the gender studies department or, urban studies or various other majors that were very sort of far left coded, professors would teach things that were pretty extreme and doctrinaire.
Were there settings that were not left-wing coded where you could have a bigger pushback on these conversations, or even there, would there be...
Any hard science wasn't left-wing coded, obviously.
But let's say, I mean, I don't know what your curriculum was, but I wonder if would there have been a history class that you could, I mean, if you take history and the indelible stain of colonialism or something like that, obviously you can expect you shouldn't, I would say, because my experience studying history at Hebrew U was that you can tackle the most fascinating perspectives in postmodernism and still fight back with, reactionary Enlightenment thought and have fruitful dialogue as a result.
Of course.
And so even one of my favorite classes, in fact, was called Colonial Encounters, and it was able to contain so many contradictions and paradoxical views about the nature of colonialism that I thought, that's how you should do it. So even a course titled The Indelible Stain of European Colonialism could potentially still be not doctrinaire, but we just kind of consider it a wash and take it for granted that there are the studies part of universities, right? The gender studies, the race studies, all of these that are essentially left-coded. However, are there classes that will be geopolitics or history and geopolitics, which will have a slightly more grounded, traditional approach?
I would say only a minority of classes were truly left-coded. Many were neutral, and most professors that I had were very fair. Obviously, I purposely avoided classes that were too doctrinaire, but in some cases I did take them for various reasons, because I was talked into it by a friend or because for any number of reasons. There are some kids at Columbia and Barnard where I would say 75% of the courses they took as individuals were activist training camps. And I want to double click and highlight something you just said, which is that you can read anyone, no matter how left-wing or right-wing, in a legitimate way. But what that means is you have to be allowed to disagree with them. In other words, if you want to read History of Sexuality by Foucault, I read that multiple times in multiple different classes. Some of those classes, you were allowed to disagree with anything he said and push back and be a skeptic. But in one of those classes, it was being taught as gospel. It was being taught the way that holy books are taught in the most literalist, extremist faiths. So that's the difference. It's much less about what you read than about how you read it. Significant number of professors ran their classrooms with the style of you don't disagree with the people that I'm having you read. We're reading them because they're correct. And then crucially, obviously, there were 0 right-wing coded classes.
Oh, yes, that's important.
Yeah. Because if it were balanced, I suppose you could say whatever, but...
Right. Even, I would assume, a class titled In Defense of the Enlightenment would be considered a total troglodyte course, anathema, and then that would be absurd, let alone something that would say, like, the In Defense of Originalism, right?
Yeah, that'd be a tough one.
Yeah.
In Defense of Originalism would be a tough one. I mean, at most you could have a course that was like, philosophies on constitution and constitutional law, and you'd have a good professor that would teach each philosophy on its own merits. And there are many professors like that. To be clear, I think it's possible to exaggerate, and many people do, like all of Columbia is just like an activist training. It's really not.
Right. And this is actually what I was getting at. I was trying to get a sense from somebody who, I mean, the era that you've experienced is at minimum pre-2020, where the world or the American discourse seems to have shifted, and this is going to be the next thrust in talking about your book. I would say that the book is heavily informed by the developments that happened after 2020, and a lot of the conversations today about elite education revolve around the post-October 7th developments. So there are 2 chapters of radicalization on campuses that have happened after you left.
I want to disagree with this for the following reason. The important date is not 2020 or 2023. What happened in those two cases was something happened in the world which lit the match for something that was already crazy. So the important date, and John Haidt and Greg Lukianoff and a lot of others have researched this, and it's a lot of great journalism. The important date was more closer to 2014. All of these trends towards ideologies, whether you call it wokeness, social justice, including BDS and pro-Palestine, anti-Israel, anti-colonialism, all of that stuff started skyrocketing around 2014. And so when Colombia protesters started melting down after October 7th, you have to understand Colombia was like that when I was there. It was like that. It's just that there was no war in Israel at the time. I mean, there were skirmishes, but there was no major war in Israel between 2016 and 2020. And so there wasn't the spark, but the underlying environment was equally radical.
Though I will note that I remember in 2021, I think that was the previous time that Israel invaded Gaza. It was a much more limited operation. It was considered an operation, not a war, and was part of the pattern that has been established after after Hamas took over Gaza, where Israel invades for a brief engagement, tries to shoot down as many operatives as it can, and goes back until it becomes unbearable, and then goes back in again. All throughout, Hamas keeps shooting missiles at Israeli settlements around the border of Gaza, infamously called mowing the lawn by the Israeli security apparatus. At the last mowing the lawn event before October 7th, Israel goes in. There was a call for an intifada on the West Bank as well. From the Israeli standpoint, the most traumatic part of that event was that many Arab Israelis, people that Israelis consider fellow citizens, have joined the attack, trying to stab or commit lynches on Jewish Israelis. That was traumatic and arguably what led to the election of Ben Gvir a few months later. But my point is, 2021, there's an attack and there are many reactions, anticipating some of the conversation today. But the protests, and there were protests and there were rallies, they did not have the tinge that the current movement does. They did not have zealousy for what seems like revolutionary violence that the movement does now. The calls for intifada, which is now the focus, which coded in the Israeli context is a call for violence against the oppressive Jew, was not part of the conversation. I'm sure there were people in the fringes, but it was not such a common chant of globalizing the intifada. So you might think of it as just an aesthetic development. I see it as a step.
Yeah, I guess the only point I'm making is that the environment was set for that, and it was just waiting for an October 7th or a George Floyd to spark it. Because and so I witnessed Colombia. Really, I guess I graduated literally. I must have graduated like a week before George Floyd was killed. Like, so I experienced it right before that. And I'm just telling you, like, there were events similar to that, but local to campus, like all the time. Right. And it just, nobody cared about it or heard about it outside of our community. Like, there was one comedian, this Indian comic named Nimesh Patel, very good comic, came in and made like the simplest, least racist joke you could ever think of and got thrown off stage for making a racist joke. I can tell you what the joke was, because I'll give you a sense of it. The joke was, you know how I know being gay is not a choice? I know that because there's gay black people, and no black person ever woke up and was like, this black shit is too easy, I'm going to add being gay to it. Right. So this is actually a woke joke, if anything. Yeah. So this is Colombia in 2018. This is the environment into which the George Floyd conversation comes, into which October 7th and then the war that followed. That was the environment that, like, what's happened now is just that reacting to a major event that like perfectly touches off the match. That's my only point.
I remember in 2014, even a little bit before that, in 2012, I remember already having conversations with professors in different Ivy League schools who were, telling me about the early stages of trigger warnings and the whole safe space conversation that then evolved. And they were describing this as part of a drastic shift they're sensing on campuses away from rigor and good-natured confrontation. But where what I think was featured in 2014 was, as Haidt and Lukianov describe it, was the safetyism problem of wanting to protect your intellectual, emotional comfort on campus from big bad ideas. Now it seems to have taken a more aggressive approach, right? A more confrontational, a more revolutionary aspect, taking over campuses, taking over the city, taking the streets, that Jacobin energy.
I mean, it was always in tension with itself, because on the one hand, you would have kids saying, we need this campus to be a safe space from racists. And that's why we are going to shout down and literally commit violence if Charles Murray comes to campus. Like, that's what happened. Charles Murray and he literally got attacked, and the woman he was with left in a neck brace at Middlebury, I think it was, and so it was, the same kids that would say, we need to make this a safe, cushy place, but we may need to use violence in order to get there. Like, that was always a part of it. And it was, I think, it was like they never accepted the logic of nonviolent protest in the style of Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement. Never modeled themselves after that. They modeled themselves after, the academics that started critical race theory and so forth. And these are people that basically believe, in certain cases, violent protest is definitely warranted, definitely against property, sometimes against people. And they definitely take a lot more, because a lot of these ideas come from the 60s. At the end of the day, it's like they're not new, but there's a big split between the nonviolent civil rights movement and the Black Power movement, and then the Black Panthers, and that whole kind of swamp of, frankly, more pro-violent protesting styles. And the critical race theorists of the 70s and 80s explicitly took after the latter, not the former. And they write this, if you read some of the original documents of critical race theory and so forth. And that's the spirit of the modern woke activists.
So this comfortably takes us to your book, this tension between different approaches to social amelioration. Don't want to use the word justice too easily. You argue that the new movement, as it pertains to race relations, the new movement that calls itself anti-racism, espoused by the current progressive left in America and by many people in the Democratic Party that has dominated academic thinking on the social sciences, that movement is itself a form of you call it neo-racism.
I define racism the same way that Martin Luther King and Bayard Rustin and the civil rights leaders of the high classical civil rights movement defined it, which is, as Martin Luther King wrote in his final book, the doctrine of congenital inferiority of a people. The whole idea that only white people can be racist, or that black people can't be racist, or that racism is, quote, prejudice plus power. The civil rights movement didn't buy any of that. They understood they were fighting the predominant kind of racism in society, which was at the time white racism. At a time, black people couldn't vote everywhere, couldn't go into restaurants as they choose, and all the rest, attended segregated schools. But in principle, racism can go in any direction, right? And they understood that, and they were very clear about that. Every time the Black Power movement, when the Black Power movement cropped up and started saying explicitly racist things against white people, Martin Luther King and Bayard Rustin were very clear. They said, that stuff is just racism in reverse. Let's not go there, right? And yeah, racism in reverse is literally a phrase that Martin Luther King used in an interview with the New York Times. He wasn't saying there's no such thing as reverse racism. He was saying, let's not do reverse racism. And now if you say reverse racism, people will look at you like you're like some kind of far right person, right? So my very simple contention is that racism is racism no matter who it's directed at. If you've got a policy that discriminates against someone on the basis of their race, that's a racially discriminatory policy. It's not rocket science. It doesn't matter whether the person being discriminated against is black, white, Asian, purple, or an alien. Your policy is discriminatory. Now, if you want to then go and justify that for these 3 or 4 reasons, okay, then we can have that conversation. But to play a game with language whereby I'm going to redefine the word racism such that people like me can never do the sin, well, isn't that incredibly convenient, right? I mean, imagine if you could do that with everything in life. Actually, all those bad things that people sometimes do, people like me with my skin, we can't even do it because I rewrote the dictionary such that by definition, I can't do that. If I'm doing it, it's not it, it's something else. So to me, that is totally intellectually dishonest. It's not how most people think of the word racism.
I can't commit murder. Murder is defined by the intentional killing of my group.
Exactly. So that if I do it, because I did it, by definition, it's not murder. Right.
Which I would argue is basically the logic behind terrorism, I would say in general, but certainly in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, where the argument that you should not target civilians applies one-sidedly because in the logic of intifada discourse, Israelis are not civilians, or you can't really apply violence. They're settlers, exactly.
If you're murdering an occupier, it's not really murder. And then you ask, oh, well, who's occupiers? Oh, well, every Jew in Israel is an occupier. Okay, well, so then it's not murder if it's a Jew. It
is impossible to murder Jews in the context of the intifada.
Right. The reason I write that this stuff is neo-racism in the book is because I want to call a spade, and that's it. And I think, I take after George Orwell, though I would never compare myself. I take after his approach to language in the sense that I think you should call something what it is and wherever possible, avoid euphemism or make clear exactly what you mean in plain English that people can understand. And most of what academics on the far left have done about the race issue is try to bamboozle you with words that they invented that don't mean anything, that are not really well defined. And then you hear it and you think to yourself, wow, that was a lot of big words. It must be super complicated. It must be very, very profound and deep, and I must just not understand it. And I try to not do that, right? Because what people have accepted on the left is a situation where you are literally writing that, you're say supporting a policy where an Asian student did not get into this school solely because he is Asian. That's actually what happened. Meaning the same student with the same grades, with the same everything except different race, they get into the school. Okay. Now that is a racist policy. It's the definition of a racist policy. So what people on the left have accepted is this way of talking where I say a whole bunch of words and I give you 3 paragraphs of incredibly flowery, verbose language. And at the end of it, you're like, well, I guess maybe it's not a racist policy. It's maybe because systemic racism is actually very complicated. And a lot of scholars have suggested that it equals prejudice plus power, and marginalized groups don't have the power to enforce racist policies. And like you get to the end of all of these big words, and that's the magic trick. Like by the end of it, you've accepted that a situation where the Asian kid didn't get into a school solely because he's Asian, and it's no longer racist. Or at the very least, you're like, you don't feel confident enough to disagree. So I detest that style of engaging with ideas. I'm much more a fan of the plain spoken, plain written style of agreement and disagreement on these issues.
This is fantastic. It's one of the things that I really wanted to talk to you about broadly. And it's something that I am constantly struggling with. The attempt to engage these difficult ideas in plain language is, I'd say, the essence of the liberal scientific search for truth, better understanding. This is what Jonathan Rauch writes about. This method of communication depends on being in a world where everybody is engaging in that game. If you're actually playing against players who are only using language to confound and manipulate, then you're at a constant disadvantage. There's an argument that calling something what it is will ultimately penetrate the hearts of most people because deep down they know the truth. But that's not necessarily always the case, because we are up against the charisma of institutions, the charisma of people with PhDs in racial studies. And who will know better about what is or isn't racism than somebody with a PhD from Harvard? You can deconstruct people's perception of reality to a very fundamental level. This is the point of Newspeak in 1984. If you manipulate language enough, you can disorient people about whether somebody can levitate or not, right? When words don't mean anything and you have the charisma of power, what does it mean to say this is racist, this isn't racist? We have the institutions, the radiance of the institutions behind us, and we will defeat what you know deep down in your heart. And that's without making an assumption on whether the sense of a shared community, a shared humanity, those principles that Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement depended on, is really something that is ingrained in the human heart, or is it actually more of a byproduct of Christian upbringing? And once that Christian upbringing dissipates, you no longer really believe in a universal community and start sliding into tribalism and find any kind of intellectual justification to arm your team. All that is to say, there are many things stacked against the desire to speak plainly. It appeals to me, but do you think that's enough to really penetrate the aura of institutions?
Yeah, I do think it is in the long run. Keyword long run, because the power you're talking about, the kind of the charisma of fancy words and highly academic vocabulary, that is temporary. It doesn't last very long. I don't think people are going to remember the name Ibram Kendi in 10 or 15 years, honestly, because although, to be fair, Kendi writes very clearly. He doesn't write in a very pretty way, but he says what he means. Yeah, he doesn't write he doesn't use big words to bamboozle.
Although he does have a lot of circuitous arguments that are impenetrable. They have a scholastic quality in that they take you on a journey that loops around, and either you just realize that you've just encountered casuistry, or you think, I guess I didn't get it and I'm going to trust him.
Right.
Because, everybody else tells me I should trust him.
Right. The thing I most noted about Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, is that he purposely neglected to define systemic racism because he found that he was not able to explain it to normal people, which I thought was, in a way, the most telling thing about the book, because Kendi is literally a professional explainer of racism, right? His profession is...
That's his job description.
His whole job is, I'm going to write a whole book explaining what us racism experts have learned to convey it to a normal person who only has a little bit of time. And he found he could not explain what is systemic racism. How is that different from just, because everyone gets racism, right? Racism is, the guy rolling down his window and calling me the N-word. It's the real estate agent that doesn't want to show me this house because they don't want a black person living in this neighborhood. It's, going home to meet your girlfriend's family and they just hate you because you're black, right? Like that is, everyone knows that. It's very simple. Doesn't need a book really to explain it. But then we've been told that there's this other thing. There's this other thing called systemic racism, and it's actually super complicated. There's thousands of academic journal articles about it. It's practically rocket science. But if I tell you, okay, the prison system is systemically racist, and then I ask why, you say, well, Kendi says, well, it's America's 13% black, but the prison system is, 25, 30%. black. So that's systemic racism right there. And then I say, well, oh, so it's just that everything in every institution should be perfectly equal. And that's what systemic racism is. It's like, well, no, it's a lot deeper than that, because that would seem a little bit too simple and also wrong, given that there are many, you're not holding everything constant within populations. Like there's no reason every culture would achieve exactly the same results across the board. And that's never happened anywhere. And it's also never happened even within different kinds of white ethnicities to this day.
If you ask yourself seriously, it shouldn't happen. You don't want it to happen that way.
If there's cultural diversity in any meaningful sense, then there would also be diversity of outcomes for good and for bad. And obviously no one cares the MBA is like 3/4 black. What we care about is the process fair? So if you wanted to say, look, I actually looked at the numbers of a district court and I found that I held everything equal, and I found that they treat white and black criminals differently. Everyone would say, okay, that's racism. But that's the same racism we were talking about. That's the racism everyone already understands, is you can't treat people differently with all variables. But
that's also a very difficult process, right? At that point, it
is a difficult process to study that.
And also you're making a very good point in favor of one of the interesting challenges that came out of the critical legal and critical race theories, which is the idea that you judge systemic racism by disparate outcomes, right? Obviously, there is a smart intuition there, because you can say that people can be sneaky, or they can be driving institutions that were constructed to create that disparate outcome, whether or not they're aware of it. That's not an easy argument to completely dismiss. Your suggestion is, okay, sure, so we need better social science to separate confounding variables and see whether the outcomes really are disparate by race. That's a rigorous solution to a mystical problem, because the way that it is often deployed is more as an atmospheric argument. And this is partly why Candy won't pin it down. We won't set the terms of disprovability, right? It's an undisprovable claim, because the assumption is that racism is so much in our DNA, in our linguistic, cultural DNA, that any institution that is wrought by the American system will manifest it in some way. So once again, you are applying good liberal science to try to corner a bad claim that is much more about social salvation than it is about really engaging with the science and the reality.
The memified version of systemic racism is Racism Without Racists, which is the book by, I think, Eduardo Bonilla Silva, I think is his name. So like the idea that a system can be racist without anyone in the system acting in a racist way, and without there being any explicitly racist policies in the system. So I admit, this is like an interesting academic puzzle. It's probably true in a marginal sense, system. So like, imagine you had a situation where, and this was actually, I think, a real example, where I think you had court stenographers that were not good at understanding and conveying Black English, like Black African American vernacular English, and so the outcomes were worse for Black witnesses as opposed to white witnesses who they could understand clearly. And this is not a case of the court stenographers being racist. It's not a case of the court having a racist policy. Everyone's doing their best, and the court has logical policies and colorblind policies, except the outcome is racist. So this is, I think, is a pretty good example of systemic racism, actually. But the truth is, those examples are incredibly difficult to actually come up with. And in most cases, you actually can just like study whether there is discrimination in a system, and that often has nothing to do with the outcomes. So for like the economist Roland Fryer famously did very rigorous studies asking whether the cops were discriminating in who suspects they chose to shoot and kill during arrests. And he looked at it very rigorously and found that there was no bias in who they choose to shoot. It's just that they were much more likely to encounter black suspects. When they did encounter black suspects, those black suspects were more likely to resist arrest and so forth. And so there was actually no racial discrimination going on in that case, but you still had a higher number of black suspects being killed by the cops relative to the population. And so that's a case where you bring that article to the woke left and they tell you, no, it's still somehow systemically racist. And that's proven by the outcome relative to census figures. And at that point, the word systemic racism and the charisma of that academic subject is just being used to pull the wool over your eyes of what is at bottom not an incredibly complicated issue.
Not sure that it's not a complicated issue. It's not, it is simple in the sense that...
Simple but not easy, I would say.
It's not scientific.
Yes.
I think John McWhorter took it to a religious comparison, but it is a charismatic issue. It is an issue that has more to do with a sense of redemption, cultural, social, national redemption, than it has with really pointing to improvement of material welfare of black people or other minorities in America. So it is a deep desire. You can't say that the religious urges of humanity yearning for redemption is an easily dismissible problem. The use of social science and academic tools to prove that argument, to me, feel much more like creationism. It's a deeper yearning for something that has nothing to do with liberal sciences or even material needs of people, but is being dressed up to the most seemingly effective authority voices of the day. So if biology now seems more authoritative than metaphysics, then religion needs to learn how to speak biology. Same with national redemption, which I think is what anti-racism is really about. The problem is, if you don't successfully get the majority of the American public, especially the academic American public, the people who need to decide what courses are considered serious sciences and which aren't, if you don't convince them that one does not belong with the other in the same way that creationism does not belong in biology, we're stuck. And no matter how many counter articles you can produce, they'll be able to update their system, potentially even completely contradicting themselves without any reputational cost, because they're not playing the scientific game where you can disprove them. The same way that no matter what argument evolutionary biologists will bring to a creationist, they're not going to be convinced because that's not the game they're playing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I couldn't agree more. I with all my interests, I might have been interested to get a PhD and study these kinds of issues, but I didn't want to, frankly, deal with what it would mean to try to study these issues honestly in the current academic environment. Knowing how Roland Fryer, who is an incredibly talented economist and, as qualified as you could possibly be to study these issues, is treated like a leper and an outcast among his colleagues at Harvard. At least his race studies colleagues. Let's put it that way. He's an economist, really. So I think he's respected by his economist friends. But yeah, the result is that the output of academia is just far lower quality than it could be, than it should be. And the knock-on result has been that the public has lost a lot of trust in experts, which is a shame because we need experts. You can't find out everything about the world from being a keyboard warrior with spare time. I mean, we need people who have been studying issues for their whole lives to call upon in a crisis. And we need to be able to trust them when they are right. And if we can't trust them, then we won't even know when most people won't know who to look to for good advice. And we saw that during COVID and yeah, it's the state of our information delivery mechanisms is pretty sorry at this point.
Do you think that the effort of plain languageism is enough?
It's not enough. But it's I guess one point I was going to make before is that I think plain language does win in the long run because Faddish language is just that. It goes into style, it goes out of style. Much easier to read the people 50 and 100 years ago who wrote in plain English. You can read George Orwell today. It sounds like it could have been written yesterday, right? It's very tough to read Foucault. All those words that meant something to his little circle of postmodernists in France in the 1960s means very little to people, to the average person today. But you'll be able to read Thomas Sowell in probably 100 years.
I'm currently reading Carlyle from the 1830s, writing about the French Revolution. Sure, a lot of it is archaic, but it still reads because his purpose was to convey, preserve, and persuade. And Foucault, and especially the tradition that followed him, Homi Bhabha for sure, uses language to intentionally deconstruct, and there's some argument to be made for that, but deconstruct the way you think about the world. Mm-hmm. There is some value in that because sometimes it reveals that language is not an invisible thing, and it makes you think more profoundly about how it mediates the world to you. But at the same time, it now rings more like scholasticism than a text meant to last the ages as an argument about the state of humanity.
Yeah, I think some people use language similar to how music is used in movies, meaning to set and create a mood, right? So someone like Ta-Nehisi Coates, when he's writing, I think, and he's very good at this, by the way, he is not giving you an honest picture of reality, right? But what he is doing is creating a certain mood. So when Ta-Nehisi Coates writes about race in America, you'll get to the end of that essay having no idea that the black prison population is cut in half in the past 25 years for black men in their 20s. You'd have no idea that, that life expectancy over the past 50 years has been going up and up for black people, and that various gaps have been shrinking, that, we elected a 2-term black president named Barack Hussein Obama at the time when Hussein was the name of one of our great international enemies. You'd have no idea of a whole set of facts about how much racial progress we've made in this country. You'd have no idea that getting shot unarmed by the cops is you're equally likely to get struck by lightning. Okay? You get to the end of everything Ta-Nehisi Coates has ever written, and you would have no idea that getting killed unarmed as a black man is equivalent to getting struck by lightning statistically. But you will be in a certain mood. You will be marinated in the mood of racism is evil to a degree, in the same way that a great movie just marinates you in a certain mood, right? So his writing is mood music, and it should not be confused for an actual description of what's going on, whether it's about race in America or his writing about Israel as well.
It's a really nice way of putting it.
Coates and a lot of other writers have made sense to me now, as their appeal has made sense to me once I reframed it that way, because like what a movie does is it basically, one way of doing a movie, I'll say, is to create a certain mood. And then once you're marinated in that mood, like once you're simmering in that mood, deliver small pieces of limited information, and it hits way different, right? From one character's point of view, but not the whole world's point of view. So you're not getting an objective take, but you're really wide open and receptive to certain facts. So if you're talking about Israel, and this is what Coates does in his essay on Israel, is you use language to masterfully create a mood of anti-colonialism, to really just set the candles perfectly for that feeling of how evil colonialism can and has been throughout the world, which is true. And then you just introduce a limited set of facts. You just mention everything Israel did after the Second Intifada to stop terror without mentioning the Second Intifada. You just mention the response. You mention the checkpoint. You don't mention why the checkpoint is there, because Hamas blew up a bus there, right? A bus full of Israeli teenagers or something. So, but because you've set that mood, then the reader doesn't ask the question, is he leaving something out? You don't ask that question because you're watching a really good movie. You're watching a movie that's set the tone right. And so that's what that is.
And needless to say that the readers will come in with that kind of expectation in the first place. They expect some kind of validation to their own cultural self-loathing.
To get that
lashing,
mood.
An emotional
Totally.
lashing.
Yes. To really be put in the mood of America is evil, the West is evil, the powerless and oppressed people of the world have suffered immensely at the hands of everything that, it's like his line about no longer being able to scarf down hot dogs on the 4th of July carefree. This is the essence of what it is. It's like what most defines whatever the spirit of being an American is, being a proud American or just liking America. That's what I'm going to unsettle the most. Precisely that. And yeah, that's what I'm going to make you question. That's and he's incredibly good at it. To give him his due, he's the best at it. It's not an accident that his books are so popular.
I just want to ask you one last question about language and clarity. The term you gave these new movements, called them neo-racist, as we've mentioned. Why not just racist? Why add that affix that makes it sound more academic?
I could have called it. I think that would have been fine too. My choice to go neo-racism was just because to some level I chose to meet people where they're at, which is a lot of people aren't thinking about the woke stuff as racist. And so I want to build a bridge to say, okay, this is a new kind of racism. It's a new kind of racism. I'll give you that.
Even though I'm not even convinced that it is.
I'm not convinced that it is either, but that's just an attempt to kind of have something new about it in the term.
No, I understand that as a rhetorical choice. At the same time, precisely because we were talking about the importance of clarity in language, and this is such a minor point, but still, I remember I kept having that irksome thought that calling it neo-racism is ceding more ground than I would be willing to. So, okay, Israel, you said before the recording that we're now in the midst of the war between Israel and Iran, but you said that you've been paying attention to the war, but I think generally you've been paying attention to what's going on in Israel since October 7th. Why did it draw your attention? And excuse me as I'm pouring myself some Lafroig as you describe it.
I've always been interested in the big questions of how societies should organize and how we all should live. And if you care about that, which I do, it leads naturally into caring about when radically different visions of society clash, societal organization clash, right? So to me, I've always been interested in the clash between North Korea and South Korea, the same people, the same culture. Should it be governed by communist principles or, by capitalist principles? And in South Korea's case, sort of military dictatorship before that. East Germany versus West Germany, China versus Taiwan. All of these cases where we are testing rival theories of how we should organize society, and the measure of who's right is sort of how well people are flourishing within that society and so forth. So those are the questions I've always been most interested in. In Israel, you have a case where you have a really exceptional case because you have essentially a Western style democracy that is organized to an unusual degree around an ethnic group, that an ingathering of Jewish exiles from all over the world, but living relatively close. I mean, pretty close to like America and Western Europe, surrounded by nations that are to varying degrees Islamist theocracies and living in ways that are societies organized unrecognizably to the West. So you have like a perfect contest of Western style democracies versus theocracy, autocracy, etc. And you also have people in the West reflexively siding not with the society that's more like us, but the society that is all societies that represent the opposite of us, right? You have you literally have like tons of countries where no one has ever voted ever, or every vote is rigged. And then you have a country where that votes, where everyone votes, including Arab Israelis. And the fixation is upon the people in the occupied territory that don't vote, or that vote for local elections, but not right in other elections. And it's like, you realize the only Arabs whose votes get counted for shit live in Israel. They're Arab Israelis, right? There's a certain lack of perspective in terms of which is the good society and which are the very poorly organized societies. And I think it's very important in general to side with the societies that are creating more human flourishing for the people in them. And it's, to me, it's night and day when you look at Israel versus her enemies. Now, that doesn't mean you can't be very hard and very critical of the mistakes, or just not even the mistakes, the intentional but shitty choices that Israeli leaders have made. But you should never lose perspective on who is the good guy in the situation and who are the bad guys in the situation. So to me, it's like utterly clear that Hamas are the bad guys in the situation. They, on October 7th, they literally went house to house, burning whole families alive at point blank range, right? This is not military action. This is just the beginning of an intended genocide that they're not able to carry out because they're too powerless, but would absolutely love to if they could. Meanwhile, what Israel has done in Gaza, though it has, in the over 20 months, you look at Gaza, it's mostly rubble. I mean, most places in it are rubble. So I get why people believe that Israel has committed a genocide there. But if you look at the full story, if you look at the amount of the casualties that were Hamas fighters, if Israel wanted to commit a genocide in Gaza, it could have done that 10 years ago. It could have done that in the past 20 months. And what you would see is not a 2% death rate in Gaza. You'd see a 90% death rate in Gaza.
And a 2% even civilian death rate, that's commensurate with most war statistics.
Definitely urban violence, absolutely. I mean, if you look at the analogous cases of what Iraqi fighters with U.S. air support did to get ISIS out of Mosul, these were easier situations, actually, and lots of civilians died, right? These were easier situations, though, because what Israel is dealing with in Hamas is a situation where Hamas has created a higher concentration of tunnels for war than has ever been seen in the history of planet Earth, to my knowledge. If I'm wrong about that, I would love to be corrected by a military expert, but they've created more than the London Tube under Gaza, which is small, just for war. And it's amazing to actually, and so that they can hide under a hospital, they can hide under a school, and there's no way to get to them except to cut through their civilians, right? Like, this is what they have done. Israel didn't do that. Hamas did that. And so now Israel is faced then with the impossible choice.
By design, not inattention.
By design. And as Haviv Rettig Gur, who I follow, a great Israeli journalist, put it recently, and it's put into perfect relief when you think of the missiles being sent to Tel Aviv right now. When Iran sends 400 missiles, showers them down on Tel Aviv, what happens? They go to their bomb shelter in their house, but even more so, because they may not be safe there, they go to the public bomb shelters, right? They have public bomb shelters, like any city that were under siege would do, right? If that's what London had during the Blitz. The crazy thing to actually consider is that Gaza had the world's best bomb shelter system in the world, right? They had more bomb shelters than any city has ever had relative to its density and space. It's just that,
In fact, many of their bomb shelters still stand. That's why part of it, why Israel is still there.
well, yes, but what I'm saying is the tunnel system just is a bomb shelter, except the civilians aren't allowed to use it.
Right. It's just not civilian.
Yes,
and
it's
I'm
not
saying
civilian.
You said they still do. Yeah. Many Hamas operatives still hide in that bomb shelter.
If you actually think about it, what Hamas could have done, they could have been almost equally evil. They could have been equally evil to Israeli Jews. They could have done October 7th, burned whole families alive in kibbutzes, and then gone back and told their people, okay, we struck the Jewish oppressor colonialist states. Now everyone get in the bomb shelters that we've been building for 15 years, since 2005. You'll all be safe, and we're going to go fight them. And we'll die as martyrs, and you'll have pictures of us on your wall. And that's it. They could have done that. Instead, they did the opposite. They said, okay, we just slaughtered over 1,000 Israelis. They're going to come over here and bomb you guys. You guys stay up there. We're going to go in the tunnels, and we'll see you later. I mean, how in this situation, how can you blame Israel for fighting an enemy that is unlike anything the rest of the civilized world has been forced to fight before? I mean, this is craziness. It would be like the way they fight would be a comedy sketch if it weren't so serious. And so this is not to say Israel hasn't made a ton of mistakes, and we could go case by case, and I'm sure I would agree with many of Israel's critics on specific things, but you cannot lose sight of the basic black and white of the situation.
Right. And listeners to the pod know, but you probably don't. I, as an Israeli, as most Israelis, I am also a very staunch Israeli critic. I don't think there is a single Israeli who's not also an Israel critic on something. You mentioned Chaviv Rettig Gur. Just a couple months before October 7th, I actually interviewed him. It was about the judicial reform. And both of us were arguing about what should the Netanyahu government be criticized for more. These criticisms can, and should still apply to the way that Israel is conducting the war in Gaza. On October 8th, I had a conversation with Jonah Goldberg on his podcast where I said, I'm sure, because it's a war and because there are going to be things that I would consider war crimes to come. That is inevitable. Throat clear over, calling this a genocide is part of the word games that we were talking about in the context of racism, in my view. I think that this is, to me, the main issue. What I am very worried about is how the Western world has retreated on its own passion for liberal democracy and open society so much it replaced its passions for liberal democracy with self-loathing and Chomskyite self-hating narcissism, where everything that is redolent of Western colors is seen as an avatar of evil that needs to be eradicated. The logic that finds meaning in your own self-annihilation.
Yeah, definitely on the left for sure. I mean, there's like an everything we do is wrong-ism on the left, which I find really hard to engage with because I tried my very best to look at our actions abroad in a detached and objective way. You know, like it's very easy for me to feel that the Vietnam War was a huge mistake, not only in lying in our government's lies to our own people about knowing the war was unwinnable pretty much, and just the amount of scorched earth we put towards a cause that was that was dubious. On the other hand, I can definitely see how sitting in 1963 it would have looked like a good idea. I mean, and that sounds crazy to people that have never even considered it because they're so steeped in the one narrative, but it's like, okay, I'm sitting in 1963. We don't know what the Vietnam War is going to be. But what we do know is that China was lost to the communists. There was a civil war in China and the communists won. Mao Zedong has now taken power. Millions have starved as a result. Okay, pretty bad outcome. If we had been able to prevent it, it would have been a good thing. Korea, civil war between the communists and the capitalists, I guess you could say, or the military autocracy. The communists win. They're winning the war completely until America comes in and saves South Korea, and then the stalemate that has persisted until the modern day. And so our intervention there really saved half of Korea in at least in hindsight, and obviously to not to take any credit away from the South Korean army in that case. But had we not intervened, the whole peninsula was gone to the communists, right?
And mind you, this was also the validation of the domino effect. They're already seeing the domino effect at work.
They saw that China went and then Korea went just after.
And they saw that intervention can forestall that effect. So both theories about the Cold War were proven right.
From that moment in history, right? And right, we have the advantage of hindsight. We have the advantage of knowing that Vietnam was not Korea for many reasons that really only a military expert could explain to you, because the big picture philosophy of containment was the exact same in both cases. It was like, let's intervene on behalf of the non-communists out there in Asia. We did that in Korea. It worked. South Korea today is a thriving country as a result with no famines, whereas North Korea is North Korea. That's a pretty big deal.
Although Syrian girl on Twitter did say that North Korea is our lodestar right now.
Wow. Okay.
Living in Australia.
If you were to sit in 1963 and ask an average American, why is Vietnam any different than Korea? It would have been hard for them to answer that question until after the war. They could tell you all the reasons why it was way more difficult to win that war.
The scholarship points to people in the State Department warning of differences. A decision to go to war is not one taken lightly, no matter what the critics of the neocons might say. Nobody jumps into war with relish. The problem of differentiating false positives and false negatives is profound. I don't know if you read the work Warnings that showed many cases where you had Cassandras, disasters that could have been prevented if the Cassandra was listened to, but the Cassandra was that one person. And they're trying to ask the question, how do you differentiate the Cassandra from the doom prophets?
Yeah. And conspiracy theorists, and I don't know if this is like a result of like low grade mental illness or low IQ or something, they will always point to that person that predicted it or that person that warned, right? So for example, October 7th, right? It's like, if you find one person that received the warning that something was going to happen tomorrow, oh, well, that's proof the Israelis knew all about it.
They opened the gates.
They knew about it and they let it happen in order so that they could as if the Israel security forces don't get 1,000 similar warnings every single day, that they have to distinguish reality from fiction. I mean, this is like, it's such an obvious counterpoint, but conspiracy theorists for some reason don't. It's like, oh, some Jews got text on 9/10. Didn't you know a Jew was texted on 9/11 at 7 a.m.? Stop it.
Conspiracy theorists obviously take it to the next level, but with the warnings about October 7th, there really is criticism you can lob at the administration and the security apparatus in Israel.
Complacency, though.
It's complacency, exactly.
So today people are comparing our choice to bomb the Fordo nuclear facility in Iran to our intervention in Iraq in 2003. And I mean, to me, there's like no comparison between the two. I mean, this may just be a result of me spending too much time on Twitter, and sometimes I worry that the idiots are not even worth talking about, but there seems to be a lot of people, especially on the right, that say, oh, well, we've seen this script before. I mean, they told us Iraq had nukes. They didn't have nukes, and we fought a whole regime change war that was arguably unnecessary and certainly catastrophic, because when Saddam was deposed, it descended into an incredibly bloody civil war. And so the same people that told us that there was a nuke there are now telling us that Iran is developing nukes. Well, actually, yes. And why would you assume that because British and American intelligence were wrong about this, that now the entire world agrees, all the International Atomic Energy organizations agree. Iran has been enriching to 60%. Iran doesn't even lie about it. Like it's extremely well documented.
And 60% is the critical number because after 60% enrichment to the necessary weapons grade 90% is a matter of weeks.
Yeah, it's non-linear. Like the first 60% takes much longer than the last 40. So, to me, the failure to recognize the difference between these two cases is kind of astonishing to me because, like, this is not a matter of faulty intelligence from two countries and hawkish politicians foaming at the mouth for war. Nor are we even advocating regime change war. Really, and I don't think anybody, very few people actually want that. And we're certainly not talking about ground troops in Iran. I mean, I can tell you the likelihood of Trump agreeing to ground troops in Iran is zero. Unless Iran were able to land a 9/11 scale attack on U.S. soil, Trump's appetite for a ground war is it's below zero. And everyone knows that about Trump. Everyone around him knows that. His supporters know that. And so to use the threat of ground war as a reason not to drop bombs on a nuclear facility is ridiculous to me. I mean, what could be more important than preventing one of the most ambitious terrorist regimes, the most ambitious terrorist regimes, the most expansionist, ambitious terror regime on earth from getting nukes? Would anyone have objected to us nuking North Korea's nuclear facilities before they got a nuke if the situation were different? I mean, the main reason, in my understanding, why we didn't do that is because they had missiles and artillery pointed directly at Seoul, and there was no Iron Dome over Seoul, right? I mean, they had the city of Seoul hostage. Iran has proven that, and because of Israel's capabilities, they can't threaten Israel existentially except if they have the bomb, right? So to me, the whole logic of nuclear non-proliferation is very important. It's been bipartisan policy for 30 years in America, from Clinton to Obama to Bush, to not allow Iran to get nukes. The result of treaties with North Korea is that they kept cheating on the treaties and eventually they had a bomb. So I'm not against having a treaty. I think the Obama nuclear deal, like, I'm not an expert on it. I think there were good aspects and bad aspects to it. But ultimately, I think we understand Iran well enough to know that they absolutely want to get nuclear weapons. Like, they absolutely want that. And the only way to stop them is either militarily or using the credible threat of force to get a really, really good deal. And for that force to be credible, in certain situations, we have to use it. And Trump gave them many off-ramps and they rejected all of them. And so to me, this is a good decision. And it's worth everyone just stepping back a moment and considering why it's important, why nuclear non-proliferation is important, which is that it's easy to say that no leader would actually ever use nukes because of mutually assured destruction. They understand if they use nukes, nukes will be used on them. So that's what's kept everyone not anxious all the time for the past, since 1945. But the thing is, that's not ironclad. Actually, sometimes regimes do things that are straight up fucking suicidal. It doesn't happen often, but it happens. The Japanese bombing Pearl Harbor was a suicidally stupid decision. They still made it. Hamas invading and slaughtering Israelis on October 7th, suicidal decision. They still made it.
I think Pearl Harbor assumed that while the means was literally suicide, they believed that they're just going to nudge America into a different policy. Whereas Iran and Hamas do have an apocalyptic sense of their own martyrdom. That is enough to shatter the deterrent power of mutually assured destruction.
If a leader believes that he will be okay in an underground bunker, his population will die, and they're all martyrs, they're all going straight to heaven anyway. This is very dangerous. And just to get back to this point, the whole idea of nuclear non-proliferation, this doctrine, is that essentially even if mutually assured destruction deters people 99%, if you roll that dice enough times, the 1% is going to come up, right? That's how that works. And every time a new regime gets nukes, it's like you're just rolling the dice one more time. You're creating another. You're just creating a wider set of potential dice rolls, and eventually one of them is gonna pop. And so I think nuclear nonproliferation is a good doctrine, and it's something that if there's any reason to use military force in this world, preventing a regime like Iran from getting nukes is precisely when it's warranted.
So what's your argument to people on the left and the right now that say, but wait, I think even Matt Gaetz may have used that point, but wait, Israel has nukes. So Iran being Israel's greatest adversary, maybe they agree to reduce or eliminate their nuclear program, but so should Israel.
First of all, Israel doesn't have nukes. Wink, wink. No. Well, this is why it comes down to not all actors are equal and should not be treated equally. Israel has no interest in destroying any other country. They have certainly no official state policy of destroying any other country in the world, and genuinely no interest in destroying any other country in the world.
Tell that to the Ben Gvir government partners, to Smotrich, who talk about leveling Gaza, who talk about displacing the Palestinians, who say that there shall never be a Palestinian state, who say that, who talk about regime change in Iran openly. I don't know. Sounds to me like there's a lot of displationist, expansionist, bloodthirsty rhetoric on the Israeli right now, and those are the people in government.
Yeah, I agree. There's bloodthirsty rhetoric on the right. You're going to find that in a lot of places in the world. But if you look at, the best signal of Israel's intentions with respect to the world is what Israel has done with its actual military over the course of its history. It fought a defensive war that it did not start with the Palestinians in 1948, fought a preemptive but still defensive war in 1967 versus Israel, Syria, defensive war, Egypt and Syria, 1973, defensive war, Yom Kippur War, Lebanon, and so forth. What Israel could have been doing over the past 75 years is, just annex Lebanon. Take Lebanon. Could have done that. Why didn't they do it? They could have said, let's take Egypt. Okay, no, they take a little part of the Sinai and they say, we'll give it back in exchange for a peace treaty. So Israel's military, by and large, has had two objectives over the past 75 years, which is peace with every country around us, no more terrorism against Israeli civilians. That model of the IDF's actions explains like 90% of what they try to do, however imperfectly. What has Iran done over the past over the past decade? Let's say over the past 3-4 decades, we're going to create and put a military in South Lebanon, give it all the funding it needs to have over 100,000 missiles pointed at Israel. So basically, to be clear, Iran has effectively taken over half of another country, namely Lebanon, to the point where southern Lebanon is just Hezbollah now. So already expansionist, colonialist. Same in Yemen. West Yemen basically belongs to Iran. They've armed the Houthis and so forth. Basically the same in Iraq. All the Shiite militias are just an extension of Iran. So Iran has expanded into at least 3 countries, Syria as well. It's funded Hamas as well. So it's partly responsible for Hamas, Hezbollah, civil war in Yemen that killed 500,000 people. That's all in the past couple years. So to me, that's a pretty good signal of what Iran's ambitions are. Iran is not looking for peace treaty with every country around it and stopping terror at home. Iran is looking for Shia Islamic dominance of the region, right? Essentially, they want to be in charge. They want to destroy Israel and redeem their version of Islam. And eventually, they'd like to destroy America somewhere deeper down on their wish list. So obviously them having a bomb is not the same as Israel having a bomb.
The interesting thing about Iran, and it's a regime that I still sometimes struggle to fully model, their geopolitical regional superpower ambitions come in direct conflict with their desire to destroy Israel and ultimately topple America as a hegemon quite often. And most critically, in the past 2 years, could have cultivated a much more cautious, less militaristic posture with its neighbors and establish itself as a hegemon that is still hostile to Israel, but is not actively trying to trigger a war. I don't think Iran thought that things are going to get as crazy as it has, but it was much more reckless because the priority of trying to destroy Israel really burned in it, sometimes at the expense of regional stability and its own dominance. Look at Turkey. Turkey is in a similar position where it wants to be a regional hegemon, has a very fraught relationship with Israel, certainly under Erdogan's Islamic regime, but it is very cautious. It knows how to provoke Israel diplomatically, but it knows better, even though it has a very strong military, than to try to get directly, or even through proxies, in a military entanglement with Israel. Iran, this is where the suicidality comes in, the millenarian fantasy for redemption. They have been advancing literally the clock. They had the Israel doom clock in Palestine Square that predicts that the ultimate destruction of Israel will be the salvation of the Islamic world, at least. They've been marching towards that fantasy, fetishizing their rockets, fetishizing the elimination of Israel in a mushroom cloud. And they were willing to pursue that dream at the expense of everything else. And that is the real thing that the West cannot grapple with, that there are theories of statesmanship that rely on redemption through death, redemption through destruction, and not old world, concert of nation, grand game geopolitics.
Yeah. Yeah, no, definitely. I think we struggle to understand and model Iran and jihadists in generals. It's like a jihadi regime, essentially. And the most important facts are often just on the surface, and we forget about them because, you know, as Orwell said, it's about seeing the truth that's right in front of your nose, right?
I don't think that it's forgetting about them. I think this once again ties into our first conversation. It's language. We've created language that makes it impossible for us to see it.
So, for example, we just accept and don't comment on, really, in the news, the fact that Israel and America have targeted Iranian military targets. We dropped 30,000-pound bombs on a nuclear site buried beneath a mountain. And this is not a town. This is not a city where people live, right? We kill nuclear scientists. We kill chief of staffs of militaries. Israel kills. When Iran bombs Tel Aviv, they just send a fuckload of missiles at the biggest city, indiscriminate. And they destroyed a hospital, or they destroyed parts of a hospital in Israel. And certainly Israel has hit hospitals in Gaza. But there actually is a difference in this case because, first of all, Iran doesn't care what it hits. Like it doesn't even make a pretense of aiming for military targets. It's just straight up, let's go for the highest population civilian center, straight up. No one even comments on the fact that Iran targets civilians. People barely comment on the fact that Hamas targets civilians. It's just we've baked in this expectation that, oh yeah, like these non-Western regimes, they don't distinguish between military and civilians because it's all the same to them. But like when we bomb them, we bomb military sites. And sometimes we make a calculation that the military site is worth killing the civilians that are there at the same time. But you can like read a lot of news for a long time and just not have that basic fact be pointed out to you. And its implications for the moral status of both sides.
Coleman Hughes, thank you so much. And have a great concert tonight.
Thanks very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to Uncertain Things. Follow us on uncertain.substack.com or wherever you get your podcasts. If you're feeling generous, give us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts and share us with your friends and enemies. Until next time, stay sane.